Hello, and welcome to the You Are Loved Ministries podcast, Tell Me a Bible Story, with Pam Baggott and Brenda Poarch. Last time we were together, we began looking at the story of Moses and the burning bush. At this time, Moses was 80 years old, living in a foreign land as a sheep herder. There was a time in his life that he may have thought it was his duty to save his people, but he didn't wait for God's timing, and he killed a man, and then he had to flee for his life. Now, fast forward 40 years later, and we find Moses living a quiet life as a sheep herder, but the silence is just about over for Moses. And now he's having a conversation with God from a burning bush that's not really burning. Pam, please remind us what God has told Moses so far.
Okay, well, God introduces himself to Moses, and then he says that he has heard his people crying about the oppression they were enduring from the Egyptian taskmasters. He says he's going to take them to a better place, and he wants Moses to go to Pharaoh and then lead the people out of Egypt. God gives Moses his plan, but Moses does not feel ready for the job God is giving him. So there's a little bit of a discussion. Let's look at Exodus 4 in the first 9 verses. Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you." The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A staff." He said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and catch it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. "That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you." Again, the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. "If they will not believe you," God said, "or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these 2 signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. And the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground." Okay, God has a plan, and he is determined that Moses is a significant part of the plan. But Moses is like most of us, scared and lacking confidence. So God keeps showing him ways that he can start dealing with the leader of the country. But Moses is also concerned about whether the Hebrews will trust him.
Yeah, it's obvious that that self-confidence that he had back when he killed the Egyptian, that's gone. And so he spent half of his life being removed from his people, and he didn't leave on good terms. He had to run for his life because he had committed murder. And he just, maybe he expected some glory or whatever when he killed the Egyptian, but when he came out the next day, this is what happened in Exodus 2:13 and 14. It says, "When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, 'Why do you strike your companion?' He answered, 'Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Surely this thing is known.' But now God's wanting him to go back to Egypt and free the people. And he's just not really a fan of that idea."
No.
Poor Moses. And I have to say, if I had thrown my rod down and it turned into a snake, I would run too.
Yeah. And
Just
picking
the
it
fact
back up,
was,
that would have been a no. Thank
I
you.
know, that's what I'm thinking. And the Bible's just so nonchalant about it. It's like he threw it down and turned into a snake and he ran. And God said, "Go back and grab it by the tail." I'd be like, no. But say no to God. Yeah.
No.
All right. 4:10 through 17 rather. But Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent either in past or since you've spoken to your servant, but I'm slow of speech and of tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you both want to do. He will speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand the staff with which you shall do the signs. So, you know what, Moses? Sorry, bud, but there's no way you're getting out of this. He actually made God angry with the excuses, but God was very gracious. And so he gave him his brother Aaron to be the speaker of the group. But I think it's kind of interesting that he tells Moses that Moses will be like a God. You shall be a God to him. And so to me, that kind of sounds like God is saying, you're going to tell Moses what to say, and Moses is not going to say anything unless you tell him to say it.
Mhm.
And I'm going to tell you what to say, and I'm going to be with both of you. And you know what? I really think that's necessary because, Pam, have you ever played that game
Oh,
Telephone?
yeah, I was just
Where
thinking of that
where
one.
one person whispers in the ear, and then by the time it gets through 10 or 12 people, it sounds nothing like the beginning. And
Mhm.
so we as humans can get things wrong. So God could tell Moses, and even if Moses repeated right to Aaron, Aaron might say it wrong to Pharaoh. And so God's like, I got it covered. I'm going to be with your mouth. I'm going to be with his mouth. And you're going to do this, Moses. So
Mhm.
let's see what happens.
But when God has a plan, and he always has a plan, it's best to just say, yes, sir, and go with the flow.
Exactly.
Let's go on first, chapter 4, verses 18 to 23. Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I've put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. And then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord of Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. I think it's neat that God calls the entire nation of Israel his son. It's like the church is called the bride of Christ. It's also interesting that God's giving Pharaoh a long-range view of what will happen if he doesn't let Israel go. If Pharaoh doesn't release God's son, God will take Pharaoh's son.
Yeah. I mean, God makes he pulls no punches.
No.
He's direct about what's going to happen. But I'm thinking about the first part of the verses that you read where Moses goes to his father-in-law and says, I need to go back to Egypt. And then it just calmly says, and Moses took his wife and his son and put him on a donkey. And I'm thinking, if my husband came home and said, guess what? We're going to move back to my home country where I'm a fugitive and where people just like me are being heavily oppressed. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go to the Pharaoh and I'm going to get everybody turned loose and you got to go with me. I'd be like, what is the matter with you?
Yeah.
I am not going to some place where you're wanted, man.
Mm-hmm.
But evidently that's not what she said because they went.
Well, she didn't really have the power to say it, but Moses' wife didn't have any ties to Israel other than her husband, but he'd been living as part of her people for decades. I'm sure that was the beginning of trouble in their relationship.
I'll bet it was. Of course, maybe she wasn't the modern women that we are today, and we think we have more power than we do. Maybe she was humble and submissive, like we're all supposed to be. I'm
I don't think so.
still, I'm still working on that. All right, Exodus 4:24 through 28. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he left him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. The Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountains of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him to speak and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. So after God spends all this time telling Moses what he's going to do and how he's going to go and now he's trying to kill Moses. Pam, I'm a little lost here. Can you help me?
Well, the only thing I can think of is that Moses had never had his son circumcised. Now, this began with a covenant between Abraham and God, and it was a sign of that covenant relationship. It was usually done soon after birth and was much more painful on an older boy or man than it was on a baby, so that he would be in compliance with what he had, God may have been pushing Moses to do what he should have done when his son was a baby, so that he would be in compliance with what all the other Jews would have done. In Genesis 17, God told all the blessings he would give Abraham and his descendants as a part of the covenant. And then he gives this explanation of their part of the deal in verses 10 to 14. Said, "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant."
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense now when you look back at the history. And I love it that you're so good at the history of that kind of thing. So now Moses and God are okay. God's not trying to kill him anymore. He goes out to talk to Aaron, and I just would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to hear that conversation about, well, guess what, Aaron, we're going to go to Egypt and we're going to talk to the Pharaoh, and let me show you the tricks that that God has given, these miracles that God has allowed me to do. But they did it and it happened. And just because I have a hard time understanding it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Well, it wasn't a typical family reunion anyway.
I know.
Let's go ahead and see what they did after that. Exodus 4:29 to 31. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. Isn't it wonderful when we realize that God has heard a prayer and is providing that answer? After all the years of oppression, that relief must have been amazing.
Yes, and that was really good news for them. They were going to be freed from their oppression. They were going to a land of milk and honey. They were going to be taken care of by God. So that's one really big hurdle that Moses has overcome, because he was concerned about that. They've got a long way to go before they get those people out of the land of Egypt. And I think, we need to remember that God cares and loves his people. He loved his children then, and he loves us today. But they're going to have to go through some things before it's all over with. And Egypt is going to go through some things before it's all over with. So sometimes you just have to stay faithful. Well, maybe all the time you just have to stay faithful.
Good idea.
Because God is going to take care of us. Now we're going to finish this, keep going on the story in our next podcast. So you better come back because you don't want to miss it.
Well, the story of God's rescue of his people from Egypt is the second most significant one in history. The first would be his rescue of us all from our own sin through Jesus' sacrifice.
And it's a powerful story. I mean, it's one of those stories that even people that didn't grow up as a child in the church or don't have a lot of Bible knowledge, they at least know about Moses and they know about the plagues. And so, and there's so much symbolism in the story of the way everything happened. But if you want to continue the story with us, you're going to have to come back. But before we go, let's look at what we can learn. The first thing I noticed is that trusting in God is job one for his children. Now, Moses' excuses were a sign of a lack of trust. God had chosen Moses to do a very special job for him, but Moses allowed fear and self-doubt to shake his faith, causing him to question and even anger God. Trust and complete faith in God is when we move forward, even though we're unsure of the future. we may not be able to see how it will all work out, but God has a plan. And the most important thing that we can do is to keep walking and keep trusting in God because He will direct our paths. So that was the number one that I noticed. Number two is God will provide. You know, when God sends us on a mission, Moses had all these fears. God sends us on a mission, He's not going to send us empty handed. He's going to provide whatever we need. And so we need to make sure that we are open to those things, because the fun part to me is that God rarely meets these needs the way I expected or when I expected. And that's, you know, you look at it and you say, oh, but Lord, I need this. And then it kind of reminds me of that story of the old joke about the guy that was on the roof during a flood, and he kept praying for God to rescue him.
Yep.
And a helicopter came by and a boat came by and something else came by. I don't
A
remember.
yacht, yeah.
Yes. And then he gets to heaven and he says, God, I prayed and you didn't rescue me. And God's like, I sent you a helicopter. I sent you a yacht. I sent you a boat, and you wouldn't get in. So our job is to not receive something unless it comes the way we pictured it should. That our job is to receive whatever God gives us and use it for His glory. Because 9 times out of 10, it's not going to look like we thought it was going to look like. And then the last thing that, and I know, Pam, in your life, you've seen that happen. In my life, I've seen that happen. And when you look back, sometimes there's that 20/20 vision. Sometimes you can look back and say, oh, I
So
get
that's
it
what you
now.
were doing. Yes.
That's what, yeah. But at the moment during that time, you're like, no, God, I didn't, I wanted you to miraculously pick me up off this roof. I didn't want to have to crawl down to get in a boat, or I'm afraid of heights. I don't want to get in a helicopter.
Yep.
And so that's what we have to do, is just accept whatever God gives us. And then the third thing I've noticed is worry is useless, because most of the time, what we are the most concerned about never, ever happens. Moses was so concerned that the people wouldn't believe him, but they did. And I have been guilty of that, worrying, creating all these scenarios in my head, and they're never good. They're like, you know, the top 10 ways that this whole thing could crash and burn. And, but God is going to take care of us. And we are told that worry is not going to make us any taller or make us any live longer. And so we're trusting in the Lord, and we're not going to worry, because it takes a lot of energy to worry. And then when you worn yourself out worrying and God does deliver what you need, you may be too tired to even recognize it. So don't waste your time worrying. And ladies, that was said more to me
And me
than you guys. All right. Well, we are now through. Moses has made it to talk to the children of Israel, but he has not made it to talk to Pharaoh yet. So if you want to hear that part of the story, you'll have to come back and join us for next time. And until then, we hope you have a blessed day.